Saggar, and we've got Saggar and Sam Nutt, both from LOTI, and they're going to be talking about the role and the work that LOTI is doing, and in particular this work that they're doing on their framework and their governance strategy. And then a little bit later on, I've been told not to panic because Sudip Trivedi will also be joining us, but he's joining us a little bit later, and he'll talk about the work that's going on in Camden in relation to a data charter that they've set up, how they've done that, how they've introduced it, and all the background for that. So I think it should be a really interesting piece, and I'm not going to keep talking. I'm going to start by just handing over to Jay. You're on mute, Jay.
Good start. Thanks, Juliet. So yeah, hi everyone. Today we're going to take you through LOTI's work on data ethics, covering why data ethics should be important to anyone working with data, and particularly taking on more advanced and complex data projects. We're going to have a look at some of the approaches you can take to bringing data ethics into your projects and thinking about that from a kind of conceptual perspective, but also some of the more practical actions you might take to actually deliver good data ethics. So to kick off, I'll just give you a little bit of background to kind of us at LOTI and who I am and who Sam is, and then we'll kind of get into this. So I'm Jay Saggar, the Program Manager for Data, Smart Cities and Cybersecurity at LOTI. And Sam, do you want to just introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, nice to meet everyone. I'm Sam Nutt. I'm the researcher at LOTI.
We're going to kind of tag team this presentation, so before we get the intros in with both of us at the start. And LOTI, for those of you who don't know, if you could just jump forward, Sam, is the London Office of Technology and Innovation. We work with London boroughs to deliver collaborative data, digital and innovation projects. We're a membership organisation based at London councils, and we represent a kind of coalition of the willing of 19 of the London boroughs and the GLA. Really kind of trying to drive forward at those collaborative challenges, things that kind of affect us beyond our borough boundaries, and coming together to make that happen. So yeah, if you skip forward now to the next slide, actually. So what we're gonna cover today, why data ethics is important for anyone doing data projects and doing analytics, and dare I say it, doing anything with AI, if anyone is doing that yet. And we will take you through some of the work that LOTI's done, exploring what's been happening elsewhere in the public sector in terms of data ethics, who's doing things really well, and what we can learn from them. And then we'll take you through what we've tried to kind of draw together from that learning, which is very much still a work in progress, but some of the kind of principles, actions, resources that you might be able to use in your own work. And as Juliet said, we've also got Sudip joining us from Camden to talk about the data charter and their resident engagement approach. And then we want to do something with you to find out about what you've been doing with data ethics in your councils and organisations, and what you're finding hard. So lots to get through. Let's get to it. So why is data ethics important? So I suppose, to start with, I think we're in this kind of interesting position where people like us, who are kind of obviously believers in what you can do with data, have kind of put a lot of work into persuading our overall organisations that they should take data seriously, and that it's going to be a valuable asset in delivering services, in a kind of operational way, and also in strategic planning and looking to the future. So in some ways, I think some of that battle has been won, but the cautionary tale to go alongside that is that with using data, there's also risks, and data isn't always perfect. You need to understand its limits, and you also need to deliver these projects in a way which builds trust, and you need to have transparency, and if we don't get that right, then this kind of understanding around data, the use of data is kind of at risk, and I think we can really potentially run into problems. So, I mean, the number one thing to consider is that if we don't take ethics as a high priority for us as data practitioners, then we're going to have poor outcomes for the people we're trying to help, for residents, citizens, businesses that we support and work with. So ethics is kind of directly linked to the quality of the outcomes of the projects that we deliver, or the services that we run. So thinking about it from that kind of overall outcomes perspective is really important. The other way to think about this is that there's potentially huge risk to reputation if we get data ethics wrong. Sam will kind of go over some of the examples of where people have maybe taken a misstep here in a moment. But if one local authority kind of screws this up, then that could have repercussions for all of us working on data projects. So I think there's a collective responsibility to really get this right. And something that I kind of skipped over in terms of the way of framing this is to really think about data ethics as we've got information governance and the legal side of what we should do with data quite well nailed down in local government. We've got teams, processes, resources poured into doing that. Not that it's necessarily perfect, and there can be improvements in that space, but I suppose what we're talking about when we talk about data ethics is moving beyond that kind of legal requirement that's kind of taken care of by information governance and DPIAs, and thinking about what should we do with data, what is the right thing to do with data, and that's kind of the real sort of kernel of this discussion, and what we're trying to draw out here from all the research that we've been doing, and what we're going to suggest that you can take forward in your work. So kind of moving to that space where we're really recognizing what the right thing to do with data is what this is all about. So just to go back to my list, so the drivers behind this, preventing poor outcomes, the reputational part of it. I think also we have this really interesting position where we can show some leadership as the public sector. We're in a position where we have to do this. That's part of a kind of our mandate as organisations to get this right. And I don't think we're seeing leadership from the commercial sector, and definitely not a lot of the suppliers that we work with. So I think we really need to demonstrate what we expect from data ethics in terms of how do you deliver it, how do you consider it, how do you manage it. And I think that's going to be a really important thing that we can establish and then show to our private sector partners. I think that's going to be important for society more generally if we get this right and we have really good processes and ways of assessing data ethics. And I think it will certainly be a place where we can make some influence within our supply chain, particularly some of those large technology vendors that we work with. If we can tell them this is what we expect in terms of data ethics, then we've got a chance to actually try to get them to move with us on that, and kind of set the course for doing this really well. And I think finally, to come back to the important thing to emphasize is that this is also about doing what's right, and that's very much kind of where we're at with this in terms of thinking about ethics. This is about making some decisions about what is right and what's kind of in the interest of people and the people we're working with. So keeping that in mind at all times, and actually that can kind of help with decision making and guidance, because this can be really complicated, but if you keep in mind that this is about doing the right thing, then that can be kind of a helpful guiding star to all this. So let me hand over to Sam to take you through some of the examples where maybe data ethics hasn't been done as well as we'd like to see.
Thanks, Jay. So yeah, we've got 3 examples here of where ethics processes might not have been followed as well as they should have been, and hopefully we can just draw out a couple of interesting things about each. I think the Ministry of Education's algorithm for deciding A-levels a couple of summers ago is probably the most high-profile case in this country, at least, of a government organization sort of getting ethics wrong. And this one, interestingly, it really relates to Jay's first point about the worst outcomes from what they wanted to get out of the algorithm in terms of actually allocating the correct grades happened because they didn't actually have the proper ethics process in place. It wasn't necessarily also that the people working on the algorithm weren't thinking hard about what it should be or shouldn't be. It wasn't that there was no thinking. And actually this quote, I think, illustrates quite nicely. They wrote a 319-page document in the Ministry of Education, the developers, talking about why they selected certain things, how they sort of thought it through. So clearly, I think the key thing from this is thinking that, being aware of data ethics as an issue isn't just enough. You actually have to have the right processes in place in order to make sure you have the right outcomes. Then the next slide. So showing that it's not just sort of big ministries, we can go more local level. Amsterdam, they're one of the most mature organizations, municipalities, governments now in terms of doing data ethics of any city in the world. But that actually sprung out of the fact that they were sort of caught out in a couple of examples using citizen data in a way that citizens didn't actually appreciate. So here's my terribly Google translated Dutch. So this isn't my English. This is a website in Dutch translated via Google Translate. But effectively what was happening was the city of Amsterdam was finding pictures of people who were just simply loitering in public in spaces that perhaps they'd identified as areas where there might have been sort of petty criminal activity or something going on. But they went through people's Facebooks, used images, and then used sort of, as it says there, the interests, friends, mutual friends, I believe, of loitering youths. So this is sort of a massive sort of ethical breach of how people were expecting their data to be used. It also coincided with a big sort of national sort of semi-scandal and how data was being used in social services. And so this sort of really crystallized for Amsterdam as quite a big controversy. But luckily it sort of, as we'll see later, it sort of kicked them into gear to do some really, really interesting things. And then a sort of local UK-based example here is from Camden. And I think this is where, Sudip later, they took a lot of initiative from this example, and it's where we've taken a lot of initiative. LOTI, you see the councillor from Camden saying, a national debate is needed about the use of still experimental technology, which I think shows why it's important. We have to have these conversations now, put the processes in place now, maybe before the technology is sort of doing the incredibly invasive or powerful things, but we need to make sure we have the processes in place before they happen, rather than sort of addressing problems once they've happened. And this was another one in terms of that leadership point that Jay was making, where this was a facial recognition tech that was actually it wasn't actually being used by Camden, but actually it was being used by someone in the supply chain. But that sort of, as a result of that, like Camden Council did have that relationship, and that's why they've sort of started thinking about it, and why that sort of leadership point is really, really important. The next thing we want to do is just sort of to work out where people in this call, where your head's at. So we're using a tool called Slido. There's a QR code there, or you can sort of log in on your phone, on your computer. We've got 3 short questions, and it's sort of a little bit to know sort of to start sort of thinking in terms of the different ideas that how we're sort of processing this in LOTI in our theoretical framework for understanding data ethics. So I'll just give a couple of moments more for people to sort of follow the links. I don't know if Jay, maybe you'd be able to put the Slido link into the chat, but I'm hoping, sort of given the audience, that we've got a very technically capable group here. The QR code and the join link is on the next slide as well. So I'm going to move on to the next slide for the first question. So here, a survey that the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, the sort of agency, is part of, I think there's sort of a corollary to the Cabinet Office in the central government. They did a big survey in 2020. I'm curious to know, amongst the audience, what proportion of the population do you think were aware of governments using algorithms to make decisions about them? Now, I don't actually know whether this was done before or after the A-levels results. So I think that could affect results, but just what do you think in terms of the general populace, their awareness? Because I think it's really important for ethics. This is all a socially emergent thing. The values that we're working towards are defined by the societies and the contexts that we live and work in. So it's really important to understand what citizens are expecting of us. So I'll give this another 10 seconds or so. I think, judging by the faces that I can see, I'm hoping everyone's been able to get in and vote okay. So we're going to just see the results now for this, what people have guessed. Okay, so we've got 45% gone for 28, 34% for 18, 17% for 38, and 3% for 48. No one above 50%. I think that was a pretty safe guess. I put them in just to tempt you, I suppose. The actual answer for that one is 38%. So it's surprisingly high. So I think that's the thing. Citizens often are aware of the algorithms, but as I think Sudip might touch on later, the specifics of what actual algorithms are in place are the things that people maybe are less aware about. The next question is, we want to think about you as a data practitioner. How often are you thinking about the ethics of the choices you're making in your own projects? So this should just be a bit of text. It doesn't have to be too long, just a few words or a very short sentence. We just want to sort of get an understanding of the audience, how often you're thinking about it, but also, to consciously get yourselves put that data ethics hat on, which is going to be important for the rest of this. So we'll give another 10 seconds on this. We've still got the answers rolling in, so. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide just so we can see what sort of answers people have given. So, well, it looks like quite a variety. Always, not often. People have been sort of trying to do more structured things, weekly, every project, but lacking a clear framework. So that's very interesting, I think. It seems like a range of things. Certainly at the start, probably should go more throughout. It's a really interesting question about, when are you thinking about ethics in the life cycle of a project? And that's something, we've been thinking about as well. The next slide and the last question for this round, and I really appreciate everyone answering, is on a sort of organizational level. Do you have any processes in place that will ensure that the sort of future emerging advanced data practices will be handled ethically? And I'm not going to give any leading answers here or leading suggestions, but very curious to see, just initially where your thinking's at. And don't worry, this is all anonymous, so you're welcome to say whatever you'd like about your current organization. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds just as answers start to roll in. I think this is a slightly harder question. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So we've got a couple of people mentioning that sort of people are thinking about it, but the practice is maybe still to catch up. People, analysis, but no procedures. We've, started putting in place structures, around an info governance officer, data strategies. These are the sort of documents that's starting to get at it. Increasingly common, but perhaps lacking in the research we've done, in terms of implementation steps for data ethics. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think certainly chimes with the research we've done. I think we'll start, I think, on the next slide. I'll hand you back to Jay so we can sort of start to talk through what that research is and the sort of ideas that have started to emerge from it.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So through the work LOTI has done, research examples of data ethics from across the public sector and internationally, we're starting to construct a set of principles and approaches that can be used. We're doing this for London local government, but we think it'll probably be replicable by others around the country. But basically to develop ethics approaches at both the local level, so what do individual councils need to have in place, and then what structures do we need to have at the London level, so a kind of city regional level, that might be appropriate across those kind of larger populations, and seeing how those kind of two levels interplay with each other and support each other and inform each other. It's worth emphasising that this work is work in progress, so we're still really kind of trawling through all the evidence and trying to develop our thinking and engaging with local authorities and other experts to kind of really develop our thinking, and then we'll hopefully be able to kind of present more and more of this as we develop it over time. But also, I think it's worth saying that this will probably never be completely static, just like ethics itself. It requires going back and checking and taking the temperature of what's happening at that moment and understanding what's changed. So hopefully a living thing, but still a useful thing, even if it never kind of quite fixes. So far what we've done, we've put together a case study library which includes examples of data ethics approaches taken in a couple of different police forces, TfL, parts of the NHS, and local authorities including Essex, Brent and Camden, and also examples from some international cities and other national authorities. We've worked with Brent to understand in quite a lot of detail how they've set up a data ethics board and some of the processes they've got in place there. And from that work, we've developed a kind of high level, I suppose, guide to how you might set up your own data ethics board. Definitely not conclusive, but there's some interesting insights in there for sure. We've also supported Camden in their work on the deliberative engagement with residents. And we're trying to keep close to that because it's a super interesting example of how you do part of the whole data ethics work. And we've been keen to publish as much as we can on this and keep it in the open. So links are there, and we'll put a link to this slide deck in the chat at some point so you can have an explore of those resources. And we'll be adding more to those pages as we kind of get more case studies finished and as we develop more resources and tools for people to use. But where that's taken us and the insights we've drawn on this has kind of enabled us to start sketching out some of this into kind of a set of, I suppose, kind of components and principles. This is sort of very much a first draft of how we're trying to put this together. But we think like kind of the three core things you need to have to get data ethics done well in totality is kind of an approach to transparency, and that includes how you're engaging with residents and understanding what kind of citizens' expectations are. And we think the other really core component there is the transparency and openness with how you're using data. So, thinking about an algorithmic register and publishing other bits and pieces about how you're using data, and lots of interesting stuff happening in that space as well, which we will touch on. Then there's processes. So what are the right ethics tools that you might need to doing data ethics well within your organization? What structures might you need in terms of process, and how useful are things like data ethics boards, and where do they come in, and where should we actually leave them because they're too much? So how do you get all of that right? And then finally, culture. So as individuals who are delivering data projects, how can we be confident that we're making good ethical decisions? How do we feel supported and empowered to make ethical decisions by our organizations? And I think that is a whole range of things, including training and support, good process, maybe professional codes, lots to dig into there as well. And all of this needs to kind of be informed by principles. I think this model will evolve, but our latest thinking is that actually probably a lot of the kind of the first bit, the transparency stuff, might help form some of the principles that then drive process and kind of the cultural things you want to do. And again, there needs to be some kind of circular way of looking at this. So maybe this diagram will kind of involve lots of circles at some point, and things feeding back into each other. But at this point, we're keeping it kind of simple. I'm calling this a kind of oil refinery or a dairy. I know Sam doesn't like any of these metaphors that I'm trying to draw out here. But anyway, we'll work that in more detail and show that to you at another point. But Sam, if you go on to the next stage to just explain a bit more about what we're thinking about from a transparency perspective here. So I suppose the starting foundation of this is really that, you know, ethics is socially derived, like those values come from society, and therefore you need some kind of mechanism to understand what people think and what people expect of you as someone doing something with their data. We'll hear from Sudip soon about you know, the Camden's approach to this and how, you know, engaging with residents has informed their data charter work. We're really keen to understand, you know, how that sits in all the other kind of data ethics activities you might need to conduct. We're also interested in understanding whether, you know, every organisation needs to do a data ethics charter informed by residents, or whether, you know, you can draw on the learning from, you know, what Camden's done, for example, draw some of the key principles there, embed those in your organisation, but also keep the balance with having some kind of representation of your citizens directly. You know, being place-based organisations, I think that's going to be really important. But, you know, what that balance might be, I think is yet to be established, and that's something that we want to kind of draw out in this work. Can we kind of come to an understanding of what that balance should be, so that, you know, not everyone's doing lots and lots of resource-intensive engagement the whole time, but they are doing enough to keep in touch with their residents, and they can draw on, you know, some of the more pioneering organisations who will need to go out and do that, especially at this kind of early stage of the whole life cycle. The other part of this, which is really important, is the transparency angle. So publishing, you know, what you're doing with data. I think that just has to be part of this in terms of building trust with residents and starting to enable people to understand what you're doing. I think there's a lot of complication in this space because you know, lots of what you could publish might not be very resident friendly in terms of being able to understand it. And I think CDI have set out some interesting ways of segmenting that up in terms of thinking about the different audiences and the level of detail that you might need to publish. I think another area to highlight is one thing we're looking at from a London perspective is having a kind of, at least initially, a register of DPIAs and setting that up so we can get you know, boroughs and other public sector organisations used to contributing to that register, and, you know, that may well evolve into an algorithmic register later down the line. But one thing that we think is a really important area where you really probably must do this is in the smart city and kind of, you know, place-based sensor world, where I think it's really important to be very transparent about where these sensors are, what data they're collecting, why they're collecting it, and an interesting challenge about informing people in the locality, in the place, but also doing that obviously online. So worth getting that right, and some good work happening in the South London Partnership of Boroughs on their IoT project, where they have got a map of every single sensor that they've got out there. Anyway, lots of detail to go into there. I'm going to hand over to Sam to take you through some of the insights we've got in this space from the case study work we've done so far.
Thanks, Jay. So yeah, I'm just going to give a couple of sort of indicative examples of how different organizations have approached things under each pillar. So the first one, I mentioned Amsterdam earlier. So they have a register of algorithms that they launched, I think just over a year ago. At the moment, I think there's only 6 or 7 algorithms in it, but the ambition is to collect every algorithm in use by the city. And as I mentioned earlier, sort of in terms of that leadership idea, and referring back to the problem that Amsterdam had with sort of it being a supplier or someone in their supply chain, they're also thinking about how they can sort of bring in perhaps bring in the sort of algorithms in use by companies that are procuring through them as well as something they're exploring. The information that it includes, which I think might be particularly interesting, who created it, what data sources were used, how the process was designed, the intended audience, and I think the last one particularly worth reflecting on, its relationship with other non-algorithmic processes and review protocols. So one of the ideas here being, how can this be challenged by citizens, for example, a particular decision made through an algorithm. You have to make sure basically in the register here that you're sharing where the decisions of the algorithm fit within a broader sort of policy decision-making governance process. Then going to talk about the CDEI and the Cabinet Office, who've got a algorithmic transparency standard. I think Jay mentioned it, but I think the most important thing that came out of this, and this was a sort of collaborative co-design process done in a way with citizens. So the most important thing that emerged, sort of an idea from that deliberation, was to have two tiers of information that are being shared in this sort of standard and a register. So tier one is sort of proactive sharing of information. It's communicated in a more simple way. So they only sort of have a description of the algorithm, its purpose, and not a signpost, my apologies, to more information. And that's sort of communicated to the people who are affected or in particularly high-risk situations. But then there's a second tier, which is passively available. So anyone can go and access it on a website, say on a sort of repository, but it has more technical information, which is there for researchers or journalists or experts to consult as they would like. And I think that sort of having those two different tiers of information and recognizing that you're going to have to communicate in different ways, different levels of detail with different target audiences, was a really interesting thing that emerged from this standard.
So the next pillar is processes, and we kind of covered some of this already, but thinking about what processes you need in place and processes and structures you need in place in councils to enable data ethics assessments and decision making to become part of how we deliver data projects. I think we need to keep this lightweight. We need to make sure that we avoid some of the pitfalls of other kind of assessments and checks. I think like DPIAs have their purpose, but I think can honestly say that a lot of them are just done and put in a drawer and never looked at again. And I'm not sure that that's the way we should be wanting to approach doing ethics. So it really shouldn't be this kind of one-time check. It needs to have that kind of mechanism for review that I think we've mentioned and others have mentioned in Slido. So no answers on that yet, but that's something we want to explore as part of this work and try to establish something that can be used across London and can kind of set some sort of reference process maybe that that others can then adapt for their local context. So more work to come on that, but that's the direction of travel we're going there. There's also obviously the tools that are out there like the ODI data ethics canvas and the GDS one. How do those embed within your process flow? What does that look like? How do you make sure people feel comfortable to use it and know when to use it and how to use it and all those things? And we're also thinking about what types of structures we might need in London in terms of kind of pan-London infrastructure here. I think there are particular types of projects. Those smart city ones might be a good example here, but also anything which is kind of cross-border and affects people visiting the city who might not kind of have an awareness of those borough boundaries, not think about the city in that way. Do we need some kind of pan-London ethics board to help make decisions or advise on particularly sensitive, novel technologies or approaches of using data? We haven't made a decision on that, but that's the kind of thing that we're exploring in this space and hoping to kind of be able to make some suggestions and recommendations around. I think that it could be particularly helpful, at least in some contexts, but again, wary of not becoming kind of too burdened by lots of kind of bureaucracy and heavy process in this space as well. Sam, I'll hand back over to you to go into some further examples.
Thanks, Jay. So this is just an overview, a much lower res when I full screened it overview than I anticipated, overview of Brent's data ethics board and the process flow within an organization. So this is something we sort of helped them set up with the discovery, but I thought it was perhaps most interesting to sort of visualize it within a governance structure. So, we start in the top left where a team would propose a data project idea, and then they complete a DPIA on that particular project. At that point, sort of the key decision, I guess, is, do you think a more substantial ethics review is needed or not? If you don't, then you execute the data project, and you don't need to take any other steps. But if you do, then what you need to do is, as an organization, as Brent, is they need to provide the training for people to use the Open Data Institute's data ethics canvas. Then once they have the teams with that skill in place, they complete the data ethics canvas for that particular project. Then they present that to the data ethics board. At that point, the data ethics board considers the ethical issues. They provide advice and a review schedule for that particular project. And then they have a register through the board of data use cases that are sort of passed through them. But importantly, I think it's the bottom right point as well, in that they're conducting periodic reviews on the projects in case the ethical considerations change, which I think is, really speaks to that idea of the ongoing ethics review process, not just necessarily being the start of a project or the end of a project, but for some of these tools, they might be in use over the course of many years, and the data might get more advanced or the uses might get more advanced. Then another sort of more process structural idea that's being sort of trialed, in particular in police forces, we've seen the Met Police and the Scottish Police Board have actually got job descriptions out for data ethics leads. So I just thought I'd share them to imagine, in an organization, this is what police forces, perhaps given that they have a higher risk of, reputational risk of getting something wrong due to the more complex nature of their work and the more sensitive data they're using. Here are some of the responsibilities that they've included in each of their job descriptions. I think, I can talk through the specifics of it. I think the key point is they're asking an awful lot of one person. And the second key point is these people don't actually exist yet. There's actually data ethics lead isn't a position in many organizations, maybe in some very big private sector companies, but this is not an easy to recruit for position. And actually, this is a position that the Met Police, they haven't been able to recruit for. So this is, maybe this is thinking in terms of suitability, maybe this is a more difficult option that some people have pursued, but might not be best practice. We'll have to see. And then I'll just hand back to Jay for the next slide, the third pillar.
Okay, so finally here we've got culture. So thinking about the broader things you need in place to empower and support those making data ethics assessments. So, what is the kind of the training, the guidance and support you might need in place to enable data professionals to do data ethics really well. I think we want people to feel confident, and when we've talked to data scientists in the LOTI network, I think they have a very good idea about data ethics and they understand the risks and the challenges, and I believe that they can make good ethical decisions, but I think they need to feel empowered and confident to do that. So creating the right culture within organizations, the right tools and the support so that people feel really able to do that is going to be a huge component of this. And again, I think what LOTI would like to do is understand how you do that really well and be able to provide some kind of resources and guidance in that space to enable local authorities to embed that way of working. I'll pass over to Sam. We're trying to speed up a little bit because we are squeezing Sudip's time and our discussion time as well.
Yeah, and so a couple of the case studies. So we're fortunate enough to speak to the Chief Data Officer Council for the US federal government. They've sort of created a framework of 7 tenets. They're all sort of quite common, as you might see across a lot of principles. But the idea for the framework, which includes the tenets, is that these are non-binding things. And they really wanted to use them to, instead of forcing people to sort of tick a box that would say a particular stage in the process of a project's development. Instead, they want to sort of have a framework that encourages conversation around things. So, for example, the 7th tenet being stay informed of developments in the fields of data management, data science, and holding oneself and others accountable. This is the idea. Is these are quite sort of culture focused tenets. They're really about empowering people to have conversations in their own organizations about data ethics, and sort of make sure that give them the license to go and explore these issues themselves, and bring those ideas that they get to their own work. And the last slide is, I'll just touch on Amsterdam again. So they have a TADA, which is a Dutch set of words that have been put in an acronym that I don't know in Dutch, but they have effectively 6 principles in a manifesto. And those principles, much of those principles like transparent, they're very common. I think I saw a study saying transparency is in 94% of all data ethics frameworks in a study from around the world. These principles have been adhered to by 642 citizens, residents of Amsterdam, 92 organizations, including a guild of developers. So this is sort of a professional association type thing, and they're as the members of that guild, therefore, sort of are trying to adhere to these particular standards, and also TADA. So they have a sort of mini secretariat behind it as a co-designed sort of set of principles. They've worked with the Amsterdam government. I think it's this key learning, I think, is really important at the bottom, that they found that the decisions about data too often ended up with data analysts, and actually what was needed was a greater sense of responsibility across the organization, not just the specialists. And I think that really speaks to why ethics is, it's a broad cultural question. It's not just within the realm of data, even for data ethics.
That's brilliant. A great place to leave us. Thanks, Sam. I saw that Sudip has joined us, and rather than waste his time, if I could just hand over to him, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sudip Trivedi from London Borough of Camden. And I think it's, as Julie said, actually, Juliet said, this leads me on nicely onto the next section, because actually a lot of the work we've been doing in Camden around pulling together a data charter has been very much about this topic of engaging with a wide set of audiences around use of data, i.e. our residents, or in other words, if you live in London or Camden, ourselves, around how our data is being used. And there's so many interesting things we can do. For example, I can ask all of you about your opinions around data ethics, what should be done if your data or your faces are being used in a facial recognition software. All of us might have a different kind of appetite for that to happen. All of us might think of different things that might happen as a result of it. And hence, our starting point on this was very much since that King's Cross scenario happened that Sam shared in the slides, where Argent, the property developers, installed facial recognition cameras across King's Cross. And there was a big backlash actually on the use of that technology at the time in 2019. The cameras got took down fairly quickly, you can imagine. But actually the bigger problem was there was no engagement upfront around the use of such data. And that really got us to think that actually what is our role as a local authority in this? Our leaders and our politicians in Camden started to call out for the need for better lobbying or better discussions and debate. Our leader of the council started to call out that actually data rights are human rights, and it affects all of us. When Facebook does something wrong with an algorithm, and there's many examples we can call out here, and someone's face ends up where it shouldn't as a result of it, affects all of us. So actually this is all of our problems. This isn't some technical problem that should be so complicated to understand that only a few of us should care. So I think this is the reason why we wanted to take a deliberative approach. Now, obviously, the challenge here is we're talking about data use. How do we bring it to life for our residents so they can understand what happens, how it happens, you know, and how they can make some informed decisions about some principles for us. So we engage with Alan Turing Institute, who are Camden based, luckily for us, and as well as involve the charity who specialize in deliberative engagement. They both were equally passionate about this issue. You know, Alan Turing Institute want to raise education and awareness around what happens, and you will notice a lot of their work is based around that area, around data use. Involve Foundation, on the other hand, help run citizen assemblies, you know, engaging with wide-ranging audiences and gather their views on a topic and deliberate. So we started pre-COVID on a journey to create Camden's data charter. It was heavily impended, obviously, during the pandemic, where we were trying to engage citizens in the views around data use. You know, one thing we did do, which really helped us, was use LOTI's outcomes-based methodology when we were talking about case studies. So when we talk about, for example, how someone's data is used in test and trace scenarios, we were able to talk about the outcome it might reach. So what is the aim that the council is trying to achieve by joining up the data for someone, link that with NHS records and the care records? You know, what is the purpose of that? What does that mean for that end user, more importantly, and what would be better as a result of it as a starting point? That really brought to life, you know, a lot of our citizens that we engaged during this process, and I'll run you through some numbers in a second. You know, they were really surprised actually about the range in which their data gets used in a like a local authority setting, and you know, that raises another question around building trust. So you know, all of us talk about making better use of data or using data for public good, but actually, if we don't have the trust with our communities, we cannot use data, and actually there will be a lot of mistrust. And you know, the user research that LOTI helped us with really reaffirmed that. So before we did the panels, we carried out user research, and it was not surprising that actually a lot of our users felt that we were misusing their data. You know, we were reselling their data to the third parties, for example, which would never happen in a local authority setting, but that is the level of awareness that exists in the communities. And so, you know, when Jay said about the smart city and having kind of your sensors mapped out, actually half of our communities probably don't even understand what that means for them. And so actually doing these kind of engagements where we share actually what does that sensor mean in terms of having a sensor across your lamppost, what does that mean for you? You know, how are you going to be tracked across the borough, and what does that mean for your outcomes as a result of it? So the resident panel deliberated across 3 Saturdays, and they were engaged in terms of talking through where, for example, they might have to consent or where they might not have to consent. So there was a lot of information shared by Alan Turing Institute, for example, around a citizen's guide that allowed them to get a better understanding of different scenarios of data use and what that might mean. I must add, we had a diverse set of group in the room. We had people that know nothing about data. We had some people that worked in the industry and were really passionate and had strong opinions. And really that's where a lot of the deliberations were really useful. And the result of it, which is now I'm happy to share, that actually has been published on our website. The link is on the slides that you can check out, is the Camden's Data Charter, which has several elements. So there is a set of principles that the residents have come up with, which is really helpful. They will help us guide as we think about some of the case study, as some of the case studies talked about different examples, some of the case studies that talked about kind of using data through algorithmic decision making. Just because we could do something doesn't mean we should, and how do we make those choices? So one of the things, for example, we've introduced is a set of questions around our privacy impact assessment for anyone considering a data project to ask of themselves how are they going to take ethical considerations on board, before they embark on joining up any data sets, how they're going to make sure that actually they're doing the right thing and not just thinking about joining that across and then finding out later on that actually something could have happened that shouldn't have. So it's also some of the things around the ethics is obviously unconscious, just thinking about that Facebook example again, which I don't know, I keep thinking about Facebook all day, but thinking about that example, I'm not sure that person writing that algorithm is consciously writing that algorithm to exclude. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but actually it won't be the case that all the time anyone doing that kind of thing is doing that consciously. And so, how do we change the hearts and minds of individuals working and using data, as well as kind of putting in place processes and kind of practices that change things. The other thing the data charter talks about is a set of commitments. Now, all of these commitments were pulled together by our residents panel, so our citizens directly telling us what they expect. And one of the ones I want to call out that I was really pleased to see was, there's enough bureaucracy that exists in the sector. So they asked us not to actually set up an additional board, which was really welcome news, because, they're right. There's so many boards, there's so many forums, their elected members are in place that already oversee our processes. So actually their views were to make sure that there's some independent oversight. And this topic of data is deliberated upon on an ongoing basis. So they've asked that we reconvene these panels once a year, where we bring in, for example, projects or theme topics that they deliberate on. For example, that issue of facial recognition in Camden, if that was to occur this year, we could take that to our resident panel. The residents can deliberate, does this comply with our principles that we've signed up to? And is that going to change anything going forward? And is there any lessons that, more importantly, the council can also learn from this? The other thing that the charter commits to is publishing a privacy impact assessments openly, because another question that we kept coming back on is actually there's no transparency on what data is currently being shared. That issue I raised about them thinking that we sell the data to third parties is because there is no transparency on who we share the data with. And so they also asked that we publish a data sharing register where they're able to see easily, who their data is shared with and for what purposes. So we're committing to do that as well. And there's some set of long-term commitments on there, such as the ones I mentioned about holding these panels regularly, deliberating on different topics on a regular basis. I think Sam and Jay touched upon something interesting earlier. Should each local authority do their own engagement? Should we all throw individual resources at this, or should we do this combined? And should we do this at London, for example? My reflection from doing this in Camden is actually one size may not fit all. And there may be topics where it would be much better for us to come together and do this, but there may be nuances around using data locally that may mean something to the local communities, and so actually local engagement may be useful. And having some sort of engagement, in our experience, certainly brings a lot of trust. We had people in the panel, and we published, this is the reason we published the quotes from our panelists in the pack, if you like, is because there were people in there who knew nothing about how their data is used, who were telling us how we should handle data going forward. And they were able to do so because of the process we followed. And we like to think that actually we built trust in those panels. We were able to increase a lot of transparency about a subject that wouldn't have meant much to a lot of that audience before that day. So actually, there is a need of some sort of an engagement around data use. And this is just, obviously, this is just us doing this as a council. This doesn't even include any of our partners that we work with, for example, the health partners, the people like Veolia, for example, who provide our waste services. So another commitment from that the panel asked for is actually, well, this is all good that the council is doing this, but what about others? Are we going to lobby that other organizations in Camden also adopt these principles? And certainly that's our hope, is that more and more of our partners will be willing to sign this up and be able to join the cause as things develop. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there, conscious of time. But everything we have done or will be doing will be published openly in that web page. So please do have a look, and yeah, happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sudip. I thought that was really interesting, and I'm actually really impressed with the breadth of conversation that your residents have had about some of these areas. It's really, really good. Jay, I know you wanted to ask some questions as well. Are you okay if I just ask some of the ones that are in the chat, or do your questions of us touch on?
No, I think let's do the questions. I think we'll see if we've got time for that section, and if not, we'll work something out with that.
So, in fact, maybe linked to what Sudip has just said, Peter Whitehouse has said, how do we deal with the ethics of strategic partners? Obviously not your necessarily your outsourced partners, but actually NHS, DWP, HMRC and the police. I don't know if, Sudip, you've got direct experience on the basis of what your board covered.
Definitely, yeah. I'm happy to start and then see if that helps. I mean, this is something we were consciously wondering about at the start of this. Actually, should we go along to start with, or should we bring a partner alongside us and do this jointly? I think the more we looked and the more we learned from the research, etc., the more we understood that actually there's a lot that needs to be done around building that trust that I mentioned. And we started by doing things that we can influence to start with for that reason. Now, we also noticed that other organizations, there was a One London organization set up to look at this data use around health and care, for example. They've done some generic research around views of health and care data, for example. So there's a lot of general research around things like health and care data use, what we should do, what we could do, etc. I think what we would love to do with our partners ongoing is actually bring them in and do these annual panel reviews where we deliberate on some multi-agency sharing examples. And bring them to life, because the other thing we saw was actually when we talked about case studies, the residents were able to engage really well. When we just talk about sharing data with police, for example, it becomes a really kind of arbitrary topic that they can't relate themselves to, and it becomes a techie thing.
Thanks, Sudip. That's really helpful, and I think you've part answered Andrew's question that followed as well, which was about how to successfully engage. Do you focus on outcomes or the data itself? And you seem to be saying outcomes and stories. Jay and Sam, did you have any thoughts?
I suppose one thing maybe to put back to colleagues at the LGA is maybe that's a role that you could help play as well, in terms of bridging those relationships, particularly of the national organisations. And if we are developing some kind of aligned approaches in local government, then I think having that bridge between and saying this is kind of how we're setting out our stall here and expect ethics to be done could be quite helpful at that big picture level. But yeah, otherwise I would agree that I think what Sudip's set out sounds like a really, really good way. And getting use case specific, I think, is again much more tangible for people to understand, and going to be important in actually testing any of this stuff in reality. Because if it's all too abstract, then even for us as kind of practitioners, it becomes quite difficult to actually make it meaningful.
Thanks, Jay. Did you want to add anything, Sam?
Yeah, just a quick one. That was the US data framework. That was sort of their data ethics framework, was something that they it covers the whole US federal government, all of the agencies. So from the CIA to the Department of Agriculture. And so what, they would basically realize they wanted to create a sort of lowest common denominator approach almost to ethics. And they realized, we've got very different ethical standards for different contexts. But actually, so they sort of tried to create tenets and principles that were universally applicable across all of the different use cases that especially a federal government have a huge variety of. At a local level, I think maybe slightly less variety, but still with organizations like the police, you've got a big breadth in how people use data. But I think having a sort of co-design process, which is what they did in America, to try and work out, based off existing ethical standards that different domains might have, what are the sort of minimum things that hold for everyone, was a very good starting point for them.
Thanks, Sam. And just to say, Jay, I take your challenge, and perhaps we could have a chat outside of meeting about that, because I think that's an interesting suggestion. There was a question higher up about data protection impact assessments, and the fact that the current data protection consultation seems to be suggesting that we don't need them. I was interested as well, Sudip, because you mentioned that this was a way of actually your residents saying that they could see what was going on. So I wonder what your views, all of you.
Yeah, I mean, if we wouldn't have privacy impact assessments, I think it might make a lot of people who have to fill them out happy, because trust me, I've filled a few of them, and they're not the nicest things you see. So my point with sharing them with the residents was more like the content of them, because actually, as they stand, we do publish the ones that are the full assessments anyway. They're all public. Actually, no one is able to engage with them because they're so technically focused. And so I think the transparency point is the key. How are we going to share what data is shared with whom for what purposes? And actually, arguably, whether the government imposes a privacy impact assessment process on us or not, we should be knowing that as a public body. We should know who we share data with and for what purposes, and have a register where we're able to say at any point what's going on,
Yeah. Jay or Sam, do either of you have any thoughts about that?
Only to say, I think pointing back to what Sam emphasised, the CDI model there of, if we don't have a DPIA, but how do you want to publish this information? Think about those audiences. Maybe you have one which is kind of easily digestible for the average person who's not kind of thinking about this in that detail, and then having all the kind of the technical stuff there for researchers and other people who want to scrutinise. I think that's probably a good model. And there's some interesting other kind of visual examples that are in the US for specifically kind of smart city type technologies, where you're using kind of symbols to represent the complex systems, and kind of having some standards around that, which might make it a little bit easier for people to engage with and understand.
Great, thanks, Jay. Sam?
Yeah, just a quick one, just to mention that DPIAs, there are alternate ways that people are exploring, organizations are exploring, to measure the potential impact of algorithms in particular. So people looking at how you audit an algorithm. There's a very good paper from Ada Lovelace in December that details 6 methods of auditing algorithms. I think it's either Ada Lovelace or Turing are exploring with the NHS what an algorithmic impact assessment might look like. So DPIA is one way of doing it, but there might be other ways of doing it as well.
Yeah, I guess that was my feeling as well. It sort of depends what's there instead, isn't it? Tim, I think we've got time for one last one, but I'm under strict instructions from you that I have to wrap up.
Yeah, sorry, we're
10
probably
past.
going to run out of time on this, but Sam mentioned the Open Data Institute data ethics canvases were being used. And I must be honest and say I've never come across those. Can you just briefly say what they are and what value they bring to the whole process?
Jay, might I defer to you on this one?
Yeah, sure. So data ethics canvas, the ODI one, is just kind of one resource that's out there which helps practitioner ask themselves the questions that they might need to ask themselves when assessing their project, to think about data ethics. And I think there are questions around transparency, how are you communicating this, what the impacts might be on different groups. It's set out quite nicely in quite a visual way. And it's designed to be used by kind of project teams, but also you can kind of bring in wider stakeholders to ask those questions.
I'll try and find where that is, but if I can't, I'll come back to you with a link, because it's something we can share with this network, which I suspect will be useful. Thanks, Juliet.
And thanks, Sam, for posting it in our chat.
Oh.
That's great. I'm going to wrap it up now. This was really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Jay, Sam, and Sudip for your contributions. Found it really interesting. Just a reminder to people to, by all means, in fact, we encourage it, do carry on discussing the issues that come out here on our forum, on our APAN forum. We hope you found it really useful. We will make the presentation available because we've recorded it. We can't post it anywhere, but we will let you know when it's ready for those of you who want to view it, and we can share it with you. We have a problem at the moment that we can't make it accessible with transcript, but we can share as long as you're aware that it's a non-accessible version. So we will be in touch about that. There's a survey in the chat. Really welcome your feedback on that. And just to say that in keeping with the theme of risk and ethics, our next session is on the 21st of February, and that's going to be the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. And they're going to be talking about their new guidance that they are publishing then on the potential, in fact, they've recently published it, I think, Tim, haven't they? On the potential and risks of using data in children's services. So hope that you can join us then. And with that, thanks ever so much, and hopefully see you in about a month. Thanks, everyone.